Most people spend their entire lives saving money for a future they will never live. My name is Nicholas N. Bretonon, and my grandfather Silas died with exactly $1.42 in his pocket. But the day they buried him, something strange happened. The city had to close 3 streets. Thousands of people came to his funeral. Business owners, teachers, workers, strangers, people I had never seen in my life. Before he died, Silas looked me in the eyes and told me something that sounded insane. He said, "Nicholas, the safest way to go broke is to keep your money in a bank." At the time, I thought my grandfather had lost his mind, because I had almost $1 million saved. I believed I was the successful one. But years later, I realized something terrifying. The man who died with $1.42 was the richest man I had ever known. And the man with $1 million in the bank was the poorest. Before I explain the secret Silas left behind, subscribe to the channel. Because most people collect knowledge the same way they collect money. They save it, but never use it. Chapter 1. For most of my life, I believed wealth meant control, and in my meticulously curated world, nobody controlled money better than Nicholas N. Bretonon. My existence was governed by a rhythm of cold, hard logic that peaked every night at exactly 10 p.m. That was the hour I opened my safe. The heavy door would swing back with a weighted silence, revealing the physical manifestations of my discipline. Neat stacks of cash, crisp investment papers, and detailed records of savings accounts that climbed with mathematical certainty. I counted everything. Twice. The ritual wasn't about greed. It was about the sedative of certainty. In those moments, the numbers whispered that I was untouchable. My apartment was less a home and more a high-end bank vault. It was a place of polished surfaces and minimalist decor, where nothing was out of place because nothing was ever used. The safe was always full, a dense core of security in the center of the room, yet the fridge was almost always empty. To me, a stocked pantry was a liability, a collection of assets destined to rot. I rarely invited people over because I had calculated the overhead of intimacy and found it too high. Friends cost money. They required dinners, drinks, and the expensive currency of time. Family was even worse. They asked questions that didn't fit into a cell on a spreadsheet. So I lived quietly. I was disciplined, efficient, and above all, safe. I watched my grandfather, Silas, from the fortress of my own making, and I viewed his life as a cautionary tale. He lived in the exact opposite way. A man who seemed to have a hole in his pocket and a permanent open house sign on his heart. His wallet was perpetually empty, yet his home was always overflowing with people, laughter, and the chaotic noise of a life truly lived. He would spend his last dollar on a meal for a stranger or a gift for a neighbor, moving through the world with a terrifying lack of insurance. I looked at his cluttered kitchen and his unpaid bills and thought he was reckless, perhaps even irresponsible. I was the one with the fortress, the one with the plan, and the one with the vault. I had everything I could ever need locked behind a steel door, and yet, standing in the silence of my perfect apartment, I couldn't help but notice how cold the metal felt. Chapter 2. One afternoon, Silas, my grandpa, invited me to his house, and I arrived with my mental ledger already prepared to audit his chaos. But when I stepped through the door, the sight that met me wasn't just messy, it was a financial heresy. Resting on the weathered wooden table was a professional woodworking kit, its surfaces gleaming with the unapologetic sheen of high-grade steel and polished wood. These weren't second-hand relics from a garage sale. They were expensive, brand-new precision tools that had no business being in a house where the screen door barely hung on its hinges. "Who bought this?" I asked, my voice tight with the reflexive panic of a man who tracks every cent. Silas didn't look up from his coffee. He simply offered a slow, maddeningly peaceful smile. "I did," he replied. My stomach dropped as if I'd watched a market crash in real time. The math immediately began running through my head, a frantic tally of his meager resources. "Grandpa, didn't you just receive your retirement check?" I pressed, hoping I was wrong. He nodded casually, confirming my worst fears. He hadn't just spent his survival fund. He had liquidated his safety net for a collection of saws and chisels he didn't even know how to use. Then, he pointed through the window toward the yard. A teenage boy from the neighborhood was standing there, his eyes fixed on the house, staring at the silhouette of those tools as if they were buried treasure. "He wants to become a carpenter," Silas said, his voice devoid of the regret I expected. So I gave him the tools. The logic felt like an assault on my entire worldview. I felt a heat rising in my chest, a physical reaction to such blatant fiscal suicide. "You spent your retirement money on someone else?" I nearly exploded. "That was your security, Silas. That was your margin for error." Silas leaned back in his creaky chair, undisturbed by my outburst, and looked at me with a clarity that made my spreadsheets feel like children's drawings. He said something then that began to crack the foundation of my prison. "Nicholas, money is like water," he whispered. I watched his empty hands, calloused and open. If it doesn't flow, it becomes stagnant. And stagnant water? It eventually becomes toxic. In that moment, surrounded by his irresponsibility and the boy's hope, my own full safe back at the apartment started to feel less like a fortress and more like a swamp. Chapter 3. For years, I had successfully buffered myself against the jagged edges of the world with the soft padding of my bank balance, effectively ignoring Silas's warnings as the ramblings of a man who didn't understand compound interest. I believed that as long as the numbers in my accounts remained robust, the physical world would always bend to my will. But then came the day when the machinery of my perfectly ordered life finally ground to a halt. It wasn't a single catastrophic failure, but a rhythmic cascading of small disasters that mocked my sense of control. My car, a precision-engineered German machine that I maintained with religious fervor, died in the middle of the driveway without a single warning light. Hours later, a surge in the building's aging grid sent a shudder through my apartment, leaving me in a tomb of silent electronics and flickering shadows. In the past, I wouldn't have blinked. I did what I always believed money was designed to solve. I reached for my phone to outsource the solution. I had the capital to command any service, to summon any expert, to buy my way back into comfort. But a strange, chilling silence met my efforts. A local strike had paralyzed the mechanics. A seasonal storm had diverted every electrician in the city to emergency municipal repairs. I found myself standing in the dark, clutching a device that was rapidly losing its charge, realizing that my security was a digital illusion that required a functioning world to exist. I began to reach out to the periphery of my life, calling the neighbors I had ignored for 3 years and the acquaintances I had curated like distant assets. One by one, the responses, or the lack thereof, painted a devastating picture. Nobody came. Not the man in 4B who I'd never shared a word with. Not the friends from the firm who I only saw over expensive transactional lunches. Nicholas N. Bretonon had the money, plenty of it, stacked in the safe and digitized in the cloud. But money couldn't buy the one thing I suddenly, desperately needed: a hand to help me move the weight. As I sat on the floor of my dark, silent vault, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had spent a decade building a fortress to keep the world out, only to realize I had succeeded too well. I was safe just as I had always planned, but I was utterly alone in my safety. That was the first real crack in the perfectly built financial wall I had constructed around my life, and for the first time, I could feel the cold wind of the outside world blowing through the gaps. Chapter 4. A week later, the silence of my darkened apartment was broken by a firm, rhythmic knock that didn't wait for an invitation. Silas stood in the hallway, his face a map of lived-in lines and unshakable calm, looking at me as if he could see right through the hollowed-out shell of my perfect life. He didn't offer pity for my broken car or my flickering lights. Instead, he simply gestured toward the street. "Come with me, Nicholas," he said, his voice carrying a weight that my spreadsheets never could. "Today you're going to learn how money actually works." I followed him, feeling the heavy lump of my wallet in my pocket like a lead weight, expecting a lecture on budgeting or perhaps a trip to a community center. Instead, we spent the entire day spending money, but in a way that felt like a total inversion of my reality. We didn't seek out luxury or the sterile comfort of high-end boutiques. Our first stop was a local diner where we bought a steaming, high-protein meal for a homeless man who had been sitting on the corner for 3 days. Then, we navigated a labyrinth of back alleys to find a struggling mechanic whose shop was silent for lack of a specific high-torque wrench. Silas bought it for him on the spot. Finally, we visited a dusty used bookstore where we purchased a thick medical encyclopedia for a young girl who talked about the heart as if it were a miracle. Each time we gave something away, each time the digits left my account, or the cash left Silas's weathered hands, something strange happened that defied every economic model I knew. People's faces didn't just register gratitude. They lit up with a biological intensity. They smiled, they stood taller, and suddenly, the air was thick with stories. The mechanic offered to look at my car for free the moment he had his tools. The girl's mother offered us a seat at their table for dinner. For the first time in my life, Nicholas N. Bretonon saw money create life instead of just sitting in a vault, cold and stagnant. It wasn't a transaction. It was a spark. Silas watched the girl clutching her book and leaned toward me, his eyes bright with a mischievous sort of wisdom. He called these moments seeds, a term that felt alien to a man who only understood harvests. "Money should grow people, Nicholas," he whispered as we walked back toward my silent tower. "If you only use it to grow walls, don't be surprised when you find yourself living in a tomb." Chapter 5. Not long after the day of the seeds, the phone call I had subconsciously been calculating for years finally arrived in the brittle, pre-dawn gray of a Tuesday morning. The hospital's voice was professional, detached, and final. Silas was gone. In the immediate wake of the news, my mind retreated to its safest habit, the audit. I found myself sitting at his scarred kitchen table, the air still smelling faintly of cedar and cheap coffee, as I methodically went through the thin stack of paperwork he had left behind. When I finally unfolded his last bank statement, the printed digits hit me with the force of a physical's collision. The balance didn't just stop my breath. It seemed to momentarily stop the rotation of the earth. $0. There were no hidden reserves, no emergency cushions, and no diversified portfolios tucked away for a rainy day. He had spent every single cent. I sat there in the heavy silence, staring at that unapologetic row of zeros until they blurred into a dark, circular void. A familiar, cold anger began to churn in my chest, the reflexive fury of a man who had spent his life worshipping the accumulation of more. I felt a burning sense of embarrassment for him, and by extension, for myself. I thought of the professional tools, the hot meals, and the medical books, and for a jagged moment, Nicholas N. Bretonon believed his grandfather had fundamentally failed at the most basic task of existence. I looked around the room, seeing only the peeling wallpaper and the empty cupboards, viewing his life through the narrow lens of a profit and loss statement. To my eyes, he had died a bankrupt man, leaving behind nothing but a vacuum where a legacy should have been. I felt the urge to reach for my own phone, to check my own skyrocketing balances just to anchor myself back in reality. In that moment of grief and judgment, I saw his empty pockets as a sign of weakness, a final act of irresponsibility that left him with nothing to show for his years on earth. I was the one with the fortress, and he was the one who had let the walls crumble completely. I sat in his chair, clutching the evidence of his failure, unaware that the true audit of Silas's life hadn't even begun. Chapter 6. I had prepared myself for a quiet, sparsely attended affair, the kind of somber, efficient service reserved for a man who had died with a bank balance of zero. I expected maybe 10 people, perhaps a few neighbors and the distant relatives who felt a biological obligation to appear. But as the black car turned the corner toward the small community chapel, the reality of Silas's insolvency hit me like a physical wave. The streets weren't just busy, they were overflowing. There were hundreds, then what looked like thousands, a sea of humanity that had brought the local traffic to a standstill. I saw business owners in pressed suits standing shoulder to shoulder with laborers in grease-stained coveralls. There were young families clutching flowers and elderly couples leaning on canes, all moving toward the center of a grief that felt more like a celebration. As I stood by the casket, the silence was replaced by a rising tide of voices. One by one, they stepped forward, not to offer platitudes, but to offer testimony. Silas paid for my precision tools when I was 1 week away from losing my lease. The mechanic from the alley whispered, his voice thick with a gratitude that money could never buy. He helped me open the doors to my shop when the banks laughed at my credit score. An older woman added, clutching a lace handkerchief. Then came the young girl, now a few years older, holding that same thick medical encyclopedia. He bought my first school books, she said, and told me that my mind was the best investment I'd ever make. Story after story poured out. Meals given to the hungry, debts quietly forgiven, dreams funded by a man who supposedly had nothing. That's when the high tensile steel of my own worldview finally snapped. Something inside Nicholas N. Bretonon broke open, and the cold, sterile logic of the vault came pouring out. I looked at the crowd, the living, breathing dividends of my grandfather's life, and realized that Silas hadn't lost a single penny. He hadn't been irresponsible or reckless. He had simply understood a higher form of accounting. He hadn't spent his wealth. He had relocated it. He had taken the stagnant water of his retirement and poured it into the thirsty soil of his community. Silas hadn't died bankrupt. He had died the wealthiest man I had ever known. He had stored his fortune where no market crash could touch it, and no inflation could erode it. He had stored it inside people. Chapter 7. That night, Nicholas N. Bretonon returned to an apartment that no longer felt like a fortress, but like a vacuum. The silence was absolute. a sterile void that mocked the vibrant, tear-streaked faces I had seen at the funeral. I sat in my designer chair and opened my bank app, the blue light of the screen illuminating the familiar digits that had been my only religion for a decade. The numbers were still there, hundreds of thousands of dollars, precisely partitioned, perfectly safe, and utterly stagnant. For the first time in my life, they looked meaningless sitting still. They weren't security. They were just a high score in a game no one else was playing. I looked at the transfer button, a feature I had previously only used to move funds into higher yield instruments, and I did something the old Nicholas would have never even considered. With a steady hand, I initiated a series of payments that should have made my stomach churn with a sense of loss. Instead, I felt a rush of oxygen. I bought the high-end recording and editing equipment to finally start the documentary project I had postponed for years, the dream I had buried under a mountain of someday and not yet. I wasn't just spending, I was exhaling. Then, I did something even more radical. I scrolled through my contacts, past the business associates and the cold callers, and reached out to a few friends I hadn't spoken to in years. I invited them to dinner, not at a venue where we would talk shop, but at my home, promising a table full of food and no hidden agenda. I didn't do it because I had become reckless, or because I had lost my sense of value. I did it because I finally understood the fundamental heresy Silas had tried to teach me. Money isn't wealth, it's just the potential energy for it. Life, the messy, unscripted, flowing connections between people, is the actual currency. I realized that the richest people in the world aren't the ones who build the highest walls or the thickest ledgers. They aren't the ones who save every scrap for a winter that may never come. They are the ones who have the courage to pour their resources into the soil, trusting that the only way to truly keep anything is to make it grow. As I closed the app, the units in my account were lower, but for the first time, the man sitting in the chair felt like he was worth something. If you want to know why my grandfather also told me to keep my plans a secret, you need to watch my next story. Stop telling people your dreams. Don't forget to subscribe and start planting your seeds today.